Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event on building alliances to forge global semiconductor supply chain resilience. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which has the mission of devising allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across our 15 other programs and centers. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics and Geotech centers for co-hosting today's especially timely event. As tensions in the relationship between the United States and China intensify, long-held assumptions regarding the global economy and the supply chains that undergird it no longer hold. Nowhere is this clearer than when the semiconductor supply chain, where a critical industry built on once unfettered cross-border trade and investment is coming under increasing strain as a result of mounting US-China competition. Following the passage last year of the bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act, a law designed to revitalize advanced chip making in the United States, the Biden administration has expanded restrictions on US technology sales to key Chinese companies. These actions reflect the administration's stated recognition of the national security imperative for the United States to maintain as large a lead as possible over China in semiconductor technology. As a result of these moves, corporate leaders who've spent the past generation building a globe-spanning semiconductor industry that has faced few barriers to expansion are now pivoting already highly delicate business models. US allies and partners, meanwhile, are exploring the implications of an emerging competition for primacy in an industry that is central to the global economy and consequential for global security in all its dimensions. Today's discussion marks the launch of a new report by Atlantic Council Senior Fellows Dexter Tiff Roberts and Jeremy Mark, which expertly explores these potentially profound implications of the reorientation of the supply chains centered in East Asia that manufacture hundreds of billions of dollars of semiconductors every year. This afternoon, you will hear from Jeremy and Tiff, as well as a panel of experts who will break down these complex issues and address how the United States and its allies and partners should jointly approach securing those critical supply chains. Today's event has been put together as part of the Global Tech Security Commission, a partnership between the Atlantic Council and the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue, which is designed to rally like-minded countries and leverage the innovation of the private sector to develop trusted technologies and compete effectively with China. In this vein, I would like to turn everyone's attention to special introductory remarks for today's event from Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, who is an honorary co-chair of the Global Tech Security Commission. Serving in the Senate since 2009, Senator Shaheen was a staunch supporter of the bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act. And as chair of the Senate Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee, Senator Shaheen has prioritized investing in an advanced workforce for the domestic production of cutting-edge technologies that help ensure America remains a global leader. As just one example of this, she ensured language was included in the CHIPS Act that finances the research and development of innovative STEM educational programming. The senator was unable to participate in person today, but she has kindly offered pre-recorded remarks on how America can maintain a competitive edge in the highly volatile global semiconductor industry.
Hello, I'm Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me to join you in welcoming the launch of the Council's new report on the global semiconductor supply chain. When President Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act into law last August, it marked a historic moment. This law is a game changer for U.S. innovation and competition, and it could not have come at a more urgent moment. I was proud to champion this bipartisan initiative to invest in the U.S. workforce and our national security, particularly as we face rising threats from China. The law is helping to not only secure America's role as a global leader in technology, but also to address domestic supply chain issues that have worsened during the pandemic. Semiconductor chips drive modern computing and have become the backbone of the global economy, propelling a market that could exceed $1 trillion by 2030. They are the essential components of everyday household items, everything from cell phones to cars. They're also critical to military equipment, such as our advanced fighter aircraft. As President Biden pointed out in his State of the Union last week, America invented the semiconductor. But although we used to produce 40% of the world's supply, in 2022, we were producing only 10% of chips, and none of them were the most advanced. East Asia, mostly Taiwan, is making 75% of global production. The CHIPS and Science Act will reverse this trend and bring production back to the United States. This historic bipartisan law also reasserts U.S. global leadership in other advanced technologies that are essential to our ability to compete economically and ensure our national defense. The authors also wisely note that while our diplomatic effort to coordinate semiconductor policy among the Big Four, the U.S., Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, is important, the group needs to include Europe. They conclude that, and I quote, "Only a serious multilateral effort can produce a coordinated, effective approach to China," end quote. I could not agree more. And while the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council is focused on our shared economic security challenges, we can and must continue to engage our European partners. Together, we can compete and ensure the global supply chain remains diversified, accessible, and strong. Thank you.
Thank you again to Senator Shaheen for those remarks and for underscoring how today's event and the report we are launching contribute to our understanding of these issues, especially regarding the importance of forging a multilateral approach to competing and leading in emerging technologies and ensuring that critical supply chains remain diverse, strong, and secure. Next, it is my honor to introduce the moderator for today's event, Lingling Wei. Lingling is the chief China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of the book Superpower Showdown, which I highly recommend picking up if you've not yet read it. She covers China's political economy at the Journal, focusing on the intersection of business and politics. Born and raised in China, Lingling has won numerous awards for her China coverage, and in 2021, she was among a team of reporters and editors whose work was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. We are privileged to have her moderate today's conversation. Lingling, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. It's really an honor to be here to moderate this very superstar panel on one of the most important issues that are facing U.S. policymakers and those in China. Semiconductors, for sure, is at the core at this U.S.-China competition. And so I will start with basically passing the baton to Tiff and Jeremy to let them share with us their key findings from their amazing research. Just a brief introduction about the two authors. Tiff is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative. He also was an amazing journalist himself, has won many awards for his own coverage of China. When we both were based in Beijing, we crossed paths many times, and I always was worried about what he might write about China's economy. He now lives in Montana and also a fellow at the University of Montana. And Jeremy, another dear friend, he is a specialist in political, economic, and financial issues related to Asia and Africa. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. He has been writing a lot, great and insightful commentaries on U.S.-China relations and, also the China's Belt and Road program and how that saddles a lot of developing countries with debt. So I'll just, pass the baton over to maybe Tiff first and then Jeremy.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Lingling. We have an amazing panel of experts today. In the interest of ensuring that they have plenty of time to present their thoughts on our report and on the global semiconductor chain and all the changes happening to it, I'm actually going to keep my introductory remarks, which will be on U.S. policy, relatively brief. I'd also like to say at the outset that for many of the people, I think for everyone with us today, the contents of our report will be very familiar. Jeremy and I felt that it was important to lay out in one place the full parameters of the tectonic shifts that are now affecting the global supply chain. We also thought it important, to the best of our ability, to try to look at what might be coming down the pipeline in terms of more policy that will affect the global semiconductor supply chain. One of the things we found most striking in our research is that before 2020, the semiconductor supply chain was largely unaffected by geopolitics. Well, obviously, that is no longer true at all. An industrial supply chain that has taken some 30 years to build, that involves dozens of countries around the world, is now affected but more by geopolitics than probably any other industry we can think of. And for that, of course, we have to thank ourselves in the US and also China as well. I'd like to also point out that last year marked a dramatic acceleration in US efforts to try to control China's rise to become an advanced semiconductor power. We saw in September remarks by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, where he put it very succinctly and said that no longer would the US goal be to stay a couple generations ahead of China in advanced semiconductors, but now we must maintain as large a lead as possible. He also talked about the role of export controls and how they were necessary to both, quote, impose costs on adversaries and also to degrade their battlefield capabilities. I'll touch just briefly, if you will, on the arsenal of policies that have now been adopted since Jake Sullivan's speech. It was at the Global Emerging Technologies Summit last September. Very quickly, we saw the announcement that there would be limits and an outright ban in some cases on sales of semiconductor manufacturing equipment or advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, which of course is a market sort of ratcheting up of controls over China's ability to produce advanced semiconductors. We also saw a ban or new restrictions on so-called US persons, both US citizens and green card holders, from working in China's advanced semiconductor chip sector. And then a third area of note, which has been going on began much earlier than National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's comments last year. We've seen a rapid expansion of the number of Chinese companies that are included on the so-called entity list. Over the last 4 years, I believe we've seen a quadrupling of Chinese companies that are now part of that so-called entity list. Now, so what comes next? Well, I guess I should, first of all, I want to point out, and we do talk about this at length in our report, it's not all about the stick, if you will, to use that metaphor. It's also about the carrot. And if I can continue with that metaphor, the biggest carrot of all, of course, is the US Chips and Science Act, bringing tens of billions of dollars towards encouraging more companies to produce advanced semiconductors on US soil. What do we anticipate coming forward? One big area is the very likely possibility of new controls on outbound investment, something our panelist Sarah has looked into in great depth, and sort of what some might call a reverse CFIUS, new controls to limit outbound investment into all sorts of high-tech sectors, and particularly into advanced semiconductors. I'll just finish by pointing out that this goal of limiting China's ability to become a global advanced semiconductor power faces very significant challenges. I would say that one of the biggest risks we face, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about this from old friend Craig Allen, who will be speaking shortly, is the real risk of actually damaging our own companies. It's no secret to everyone here that many US companies are deeply, deeply reliant on the Chinese market, from Qualcomm, Broadcom, Texas Instruments, Qorvo, the list goes on. A recent American Chamber of Commerce report looked at the potential damage in a worst case scenario when sales of US semiconductors to China went to zero, and concluded that annual revenue loss could reach as high as $83 billion. And it's not just the companies being hurt, of course, but also could be a major job destroyer. I believe they found that 124,000 jobs, American jobs, could end if in this worst case scenario. The other broad area, just quickly highlight, is I think we face a significant challenge in ensuring that our allies join us in these sanctions. First of all, we need to convince them to do something that often goes against their economic interests. Many of them also are major beneficiaries of the China market. And secondly, we also need to ensure that they do not play sort of a backfill role and actually start to grab up revenues that are foregone by US companies that are following these sanctions. So some very significant challenges ahead. I'm going to stop here and hand it over to my colleague Jeremy now.
Thanks, Tiff. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and thanks to our panelists for being with us. Let me pick right up sort of the thread of our paper where Tiff left off. You know, a central point that we develop in the paper is that U.S. policy is aimed not only at blocking China's access to advanced semiconductors and semiconductor making technology, but it's also aimed ultimately at a reorientation of semiconductor supply chains back toward the U.S. in particular. And here we're especially talking about the fabrication of advanced chips. So in doing this paper, we've tried to assess the impact of U.S. policy on the existing supply chain, or supply chains, as some would prefer to say, and to highlight vulnerabilities and risks for the industry, which has evolved, as Tiff was saying, on a globalized scale. This evolution has basically taken place in the absence of significant geopolitical constraints. And the model that emerged in the industry with this kind of supply chain was one of interdependence. Which we say in the paper is essentially something of a mantra in the semiconductor industry. The reality is that China's emergence as a semiconductor power at this point and its effort to develop its own self-reliant and cutting-edge semiconductor industry has provoked a U.S. policy response that is shaking the industry's globalized model. And I would say at this point that Tiff and I believe that from the perspective of U.S. national security, the Biden administration's policy is necessary and fully justified. But the policy already has highlighted industry vulnerabilities and has negatively affected some important companies, as Tiff touched on there. So there's clearly potential now for wider impact if the U.S. policy deepens, and this ultimately could have ramifications that extend far beyond semiconductors. In the paper, we've explored the impact of the policy across the most visible players in the industry, which is to say China, the US, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and the Netherlands. And we've tried to give a sense of some of the potential problems that could emerge. A couple of quick points on this survey that we do. Clearly, China is most affected as the target of the export restrictions, but China is much more than just a destination for sales of chips and chip-making technology. It's also a major producer in its own right, an exporter of chips, and one of the global industry's largest providers of a key segment of the industry, which is chip assembly, packaging, and testing services. So just as the US has identified choke points in China's industry where it's vulnerable, where it's reliant on imports, China itself, I think, probably understands that it also has potential choke points at its fingertips for various parts of the industry, including US chip makers. And here again, chip assembly and packaging is crucial. We also talk about Taiwan and South Korea, who rely on China as a major market for their exports. Overall, Taiwan has not been hit as hard by the US export constraints as others, although the biggest Taiwanese chip maker, TSMC, now is really expected to do much more policing of its orders to Chinese customers because of specific technical parameters in the US rules. South Korea is probably facing a tougher time right now. Its two biggest Two of its biggest chip makers are Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. They have major memory chip production facilities in China, both producing for export and for the Chinese market. And while they've received one-year deferrals from the US on specific US-made technology that's in these plants, there's now serious uncertainty hanging over a significant part of their global operations. And it's interesting that Samsung is talking much more now about building multiple new plants in the US to take advantage of the CHIPS Act, and partly as a result of this, I think. Tiff has touched on the diplomatic issues that are starting to emerge, and Sarah is going to, I think, get into this on the panel. Let me just say that there's been a real challenge for the US because of the impact of the sales restrictions on Japanese and Dutch makers of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. I'll come back to that in a moment, because we do make a couple of recommendations in the paper that I'll go through real quickly. The first is, it's very important that future actions against China's semiconductor industry be calibrated to minimize or smooth out disruptions in the global industry. I think we've reached the point that further damage to the bottom line at important companies because of the changing environment for sales to China will ultimately yield fewer monetary resources that are necessary to fund R&D and new investments. And this is the lifeblood of an industry that's built on innovation. Secondly, the point about economic interdependence with China, it remains crucial. A lot of the governments are very aware that this is a two-way street. And particularly, for example, Taiwan's leaders have emphasized the importance of cross-straits trade and investment in this industry as they encourage their business leaders, even as they encourage their business leaders to diversify away from China. We fully understand the importance of a tougher US stance vis-a-vis China, but China's dependence on the world can still provide, shall we say, guardrails against instability in this world and strengthen the viability of US corporations as well, something I'm sure that Craig and Jimmy can get into. Third, as Tiff has touched on, and as Sarah will get into, diplomacy cannot be a sometime proposition for this industry. It's very important the Biden administration continue to pursue economic diplomacy so that there's a united front. And I think this is the point that Ling Ling raised as well. Finally, the US really needs to address the vulnerabilities that the US semiconductor industry faces and vulnerability that other countries' industries face as well, especially two areas: the reliance on semiconductor packaging and assembly in Asia, including China, and the serious looming shortage of semiconductor engineers and technicians in this country, particularly because of the investments that are now being made. Semiconductor fabs are very sexy and essential for the US industry, but much more is needed in the way of investment over a long period of time if there's going to be a reorientation of semiconductor supply chains. Anyway, I've gone on for a while, so I'll stop there and let Ling Ling turn it over to the panel. Thanks a lot.
Well, really, really excellent, summaries of your report, Tiff and Jeremy. Now I'm just going to turn the mic over to the other four panelists here to provide feedback and offer their own views on this topic and on Tiff and Jeremy's findings. Obviously all of them are really superstar analysts and voices for the industry in their own right. So my introduction, I'll try to be very brief with my introductions. First is Craig Allen. He is the president of the US-China Business Council, who has played a tremendous role in advancing US industry's interests in China. And he began, he used to be a very revered diplomat, serving in the government. I think he started in 1985. So someone that has enjoyed great respect from a lot of us, journalists and executives and everybody. So the next up is Jimmy Goodrich. For the topic about semiconductors, you can't really afford to not know Jimmy. He's vice president for global policy at SIA, and in this role, Jimmy leads the organization's Semiconductor Industry Association's global policy team and directs the group's international competitiveness, trade, export control, supply chain, global market research, and China policy agenda. Jimmy reads and speaks, and I don't know if you write in Chinese, and sometimes he even put me to shame, when he speaks Chinese. Then there is Martin Kazempa. Martin, he's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics as a research fellow. He is he once worked as a Fulbright scholar in Germany and studied at Peking University's China Center for Economic Research. And he's the expert on financial regulations, financial regulators in China. And he recently published a book about the financial innovations in China. It's really a must read. Then finally, but not the least, is Sarah Densman. Sarah is a non-resident senior fellow with the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. She's a very renowned expert on diplomacy, geopolitical matters at the Indiana University, Bloomington. He really, has tremendous expertise in the political economy of international investment and finance. So, without wasting too much time going through the list, I'll pass this mic to Craig first.
Terrific. Thank you, Ling Ling, and what a wonderful opportunity to comment on what I think is a fantastic paper. Jed and Tiff are two of the finest thinkers and writers in the field, and I hope that this paper is read widely. It's truly an excellent contribution to an important public policy debate, and so congratulations. In our public forums, we often overstate a problem and then understate the cost of addressing that problem. And nowhere is this more true than in the case of export controls and economic sanctions. History teaches us that the unintended consequences of overly broad and unilateral export controls can be very high. We need to have a discussion on the costs of export controls to American companies, workers, and long-term American competitiveness in the global economy. And I would summarize the cost by noting that unilateral American trade barriers, unilateral American export controls, or potentially unilateral outbound investment controls all asymmetrically hurt American companies and long-term American competitiveness while simultaneously advantaging our global competitors. So let me follow up on a few detailed points brought out in the paper. First, as Jed had noted, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that we need to maintain as large a lead as possible in the semiconductor industry over China. Well, what are the costs of this new strategy, maintaining as large a lead as possible? U.S. chip makers and manufacturing equipment makers derive a significant percentage of their revenue from China, and that now, of course, is threatened. the paper points out that in a worst case scenario, $83 billion worth of exports and 124,000 American jobs will be lost if sales to China stop entirely. Moreover, the sliding scale of or the lack of a sliding scale means that annual revenue losses due to export controls will probably creep up as China's industry moves beyond the boundaries set on October 2nd. So second, let's beware of the unintended consequences of unilateral export controls, both in China and in the global supply chain. Unilateral export controls have meant that European and Japanese equipment manufacturers have, at a steep premium for themselves, seized global market share from their American counterparts in China. As American companies have been forced out of Chinese factories, they bump into the visiting sales teams from around the world who are happy to replace them. As the scale of the China market is so large, these losses for American firms and the gains for foreign firms will reduce our ability to fund R&D and maintain long-term competitiveness in the future. But the effects don't stop with the market share of American companies in China. The administration strategy also risks the de-Americanization of the entire global supply chain. Expanding the entity list means that there is an ever-growing lucrative market for semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment that is not made with US products, processes, personnel, or IP. The regulations have put a premium on reducing American equipment in any product made around the world where China is a potential market. Third, the export controls imposed thus far create massive uncertainty. Vagueness around the regulations has led to a huge amount of overcompliance where companies are restricting what they suspect might be broader than necessary business segments to avoid penalties, all the while losing revenues. The regulations need to be made much more precise or the losses will expand. Fourth, there's a lot of voices in China for retaliation, and these voices are growing. Prominent academics in China have spoken up for both punitive measures and increased industrial policies. So how should we consider these threats, and how will they evolve over time, and what might be the long-term consequences? And let's not forget that the Chinese have taken us to the WTO over these export controls. And what does that mean for global governance? Fifth, talent is a critical resource. China has really fantastic talent, and that talent pool is growing. American companies need to access that talent pool on an equal basis with our European and Japanese competitors if we are to compete on an equal basis globally. The US persons part of the October regulation has forced engineers to choose between the US and China, and has put a huge strain on cross-border academic research. And finally, I think that we need to consider the impact on legacy chips and the industries that rely upon them. Although the controls are ostensibly aimed at 14 nanometer and below logic chips with similar thresholds for memory, the legacy sector will also be impacted. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment is replete with legacy and analog chips, and Chinese efforts to design out American equipment and componentry will not end at the 14 nanometer level. So in conclusion, I think that we really need to remember our history. Export controls and unilateral sanctions can come at a very high cost in terms of American jobs, American competitiveness, and America's relationship with our allies. Export controls and sanctions should be as targeted as possible in their goals and scope and as multinational as possible in their implementation. Thank you.
Very thought-provoking points laid out by Craig. Thank you very much. And now next up is Jimmy. Love to hear what you think about the report and the points, just laid out by Craig. The very high cost for American companies, American competitiveness. Thank you.
Well, Ling, thanks for that. And always excited to be on a panel with so many different experts and old friends on an important topic. And the report as well, just echoing what everyone said already. I think it's a valuable contribution to the fact that our industry is incredibly global and that no one company or country is able to indigenize all of these supply chains within their own borders. And what it really underscores is that cooperation with allies and partners across the supply chain and recognition that China will have for the foreseeable future a role in the supply chain is incredibly important. Overall, the Semiconductor Industry Association, we continue to believe that our success and our future as it relates to the competitiveness of semiconductor technology is likely going to be defined by our affirmative steps to bolster our industrial base rather than defensive steps that will have an effect and may provide an important role in securing our national security, addressing targeted national security concerns, but rebuilding our supply chains, increasing the U.S. share of chip manufacturing capacity, developing our workforce, increasing investments into research development. Those are going to be defined by actions that we take here at home. As the senator earlier on the panel pointed out, the CHIPS and Science Act, we think, is an incredible historic achievement that's going to put the U.S. in very strong footing to, over the long run, increase the competitiveness of the U.S. semiconductor sector. We have certainly lost sight of the strategic importance of the sector over the last couple of decades. The COVID crisis, ongoing tensions between the U.S. and China, the Taiwan Straits crisis has all underscored the importance of this industry for policymakers. And now our challenge ahead of us is to how to take advantage of this attention and how to ensure that whether it's the CHIPS Act or export controls, that they are appropriately implemented expediently while also taking into account important input from the industry. So what does that all mean? I think as the report points out, we're not going to be able to rebuild everything here in the United States. We can, however, focus on some of our key gaps and vulnerabilities like leading edge logic and memory, some advanced packaging, critical analog semiconductor capabilities for targeted support here in the United States, a result of the CHIPS and Science Act and the Investment Tax Credit. But there are other parts of the supply chain, for example, some of the lower end assembly test and packaging, critical materials, gases, intermediate inputs into the supply chain that are currently produced in areas such as China, a huge percentage. And if we want to have a rebalanced supply chain, we're going to have to work with allies and partners across the world, from Latin America and countries like Mexico to Southeast Asia, to rebalance parts of those supply chains. And then let's not forget that it's not all about manufacturing. In fact, around 50% of the value add for the semiconductor sector comes from the design of chips. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. The US is a leader in chip design. China is moving up rapidly. There's thousands of new chip design companies within China. And of course, we've given them a tremendous amount of incentive and push to increase their design capabilities with increased export controls. So we think focusing on our workforce, investments into chip design, perhaps extending tax credits to include chip design activity here in the United States could be a good way to solidify the US lead in chip design for the foreseeable future. And of course, on the export control points that Craig already discussed at great length, I won't go into a lot more there. I agree with much of what he's already said. Working with allies and partners is essential. The good news is that the Biden administration is very cognizant of this. I think there's support on a bipartisan basis for a multilateral approach. The 2018 ECRA legislation, which solidified export controls and expanded CFIUS, underscored this around the importance of working with allies. And there's reports of a potential alignment between Japan, the Netherlands, the United States on some aspects of the October 7 export control rules. And as Craig has mentioned, the industry is watching this closely because any type of rule or regulation that's going to put US companies at a disadvantage still allows sensitive technology to flow into hands of those that the US government does not want, really is just an ineffective and counterproductive policy. So there's a lot of different terrain to cover, but I think more importantly, as the report discusses, it's around what we do at home, the steps we take to strengthen our industrial resilience here. And that's going to require cooperation with allies across the supply chain. And I think we're already on a good path to doing that. And we look forward to more steps to do so.
Excellent. It comes down to what we do at home, as opposed to be overly defensive. So next panelist, Martin, please provide your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. I just want to congratulate the authors of the paper. It synthesizes a ton of information, provides a really useful overview of the issues and sensible, I think, policy recommendations in a very complex area. So I think they've really done a public service here on such a crucial issue. Especially they teased out the interdependencies that have been talked about also by the previous speakers. For example, the role of multinational firms that are producing much of China's exports of chips and the threat of US export controls to that model. What I'm going to do is kind of make points in three areas. The first is simply to say that the US is much stronger in chips than most people realize. There's this kind of narrative that the US has been asleep at the wheel. We haven't been doing industrial policy. We haven't been subsidizing like everyone else, and we've kind of lost the plot. But in EDA tools, for example, which is crucial to the development of chips, we have a near monopoly, if not essentially a complete monopoly. The top 3 of the top 5 makers of semiconductor manufacturing equipment are American companies. And one of my colleagues did an estimate that 20% of the chip sales globally by value are actually made in the United States, whereas US headquartered firms sold 46% of world semiconductors. So this is not an area where we don't do anything. Of course, there are areas which some of the previous speakers underscored, like advanced logic chips, where we are not providers. But it's not like the US is really coming from behind overall. In an interdependent, globalized supply chain, we play such a crucial role. Going deeper on 2 issues to round this out. One is, I think the multilateral point they make that diplomacy is crucial is of utmost importance, and that's something that Jimmy and Craig also mentioned. It's really interesting that it's a pretty small group of countries you need to get near complete coverage of the key links of the supply chain in this area, even though it's sort of widely geographically distributed, many of these cross borders. It makes a lot of sense to get a plurilateral group together. I really agree with the report that SHIPS 4 is not enough. You cannot do this without, especially many European countries, which include the Netherlands with ASML, but also some of the German suppliers who play an important role in supply chains. And one of the tensions here is going to be if you include Taiwan, then many other countries will not want to join because they'll think it's going to piss off China and make them think that, make China think they're recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign country. I think there's a real opportunity to turn the controls on Russia and the freeze of the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is the main international forum for multilateral export controls. It includes Russia, so Russia's not allowing any new technologies into the control list. There's a real opportunity to turn that set of interesting institutional challenges into a potential new institution that could do strategic export controls on China in this area. If you want to multilateralize it, however, you really need to come together with both the common security concerns and how they map out to controls. What are the technologies that are controlled? And the tough thing for the US is if you want to actually make these multilateral and less effective, you probably have to water them down a bit because your security concerns are not fully shared by the other countries. And even if they are, maybe they think that the technology threshold should be set somewhere else. I don't think this is a lot more art than science. And we see in the October 7th controls, for example, which the US would have loved to have be multilateral, are not multilateral. And from all the indications so far, although there's news of some agreement, it seems like it's kind of IPEF style. There's an agreement to negotiate and not actually an agreement to do anything. Maybe that's wrong, but it's impossible to falsify because we don't have any public information about it. I would note US always has this big stick of FDPR, the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which allows it to impose controls on chips made anywhere in the world with US tech. But the more it uses it, as Jimmy and Craig mentioned, the more it incentivizes designing out of American components. So we have to be very careful with the leverage that we have and really try to use diplomacy when we can. I'll conclude with some of the estimates of the effects on China and ability to catch up. Whether these controls will be effective long term really depends, in addition to whether they can get the technology from someone else, which is the previous set of points, on whether they galvanize indigenous development in China that is sufficient to overcome being hobbled with the cutoff of access to US equipment and expertise. I find it extremely interesting that the initial news that China would put this massive subsidy package into its semiconductor sector was actually reversed. And one reason for that is that everyone who's been in charge of putting money from Chinese state coffers into semiconductor companies has now gone down for corruption. And they haven't really got the results from that they would like. I fear that what we're going to get is a doubling down on semiconductors that don't trip these controls, which could lead to a repeat of what happened in solar, where you have dumping of subsidized chips on the world that distort these markets and put a lot of firms, non-Chinese firms, out of business and might not be good for the world. So whether I think these controls are a good idea or a bad idea somewhat depends on the day and what I'm looking at and who I'm listening to that day. But the bottom line is it's very uncertain. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Martin. Very valuable input. Next up is Sarah. Everybody talked about the need to work with other countries in terms of, trying to confront with China on, this kind of issues. How much leverage does the U.S. have? And love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today and quite the honor to be on such a fantastic panel. I want to also echo the other panelists in commending the authors of this report for really excellent work. This is the part in a panel where normally you have the person that comes in with a alternative viewpoint to throw some bombs. But unfortunately for everyone, that would make the panel more interesting. But unfortunately, we have a bit of a mind meld here on this panel because I think that the previous commenters really made excellent points, stealing some of my talking points right out from my prepared remarks. So really what I'm here to do is at this point, just to kind of pull on a few of these threads. So two of the recommendations provided in the closing of the report are to do not undervalue interdependence, and diplomacy is not a sometimes proposition. And I think that these are both really important points that relate to each other in important ways. So when we think about diplomacy around this issue, what we really are talking about is that the US is much further ahead of many of our partners and allies at this point in terms of what we think it is appropriate to do with respect to export controls and what our goals are with those export controls. So over the past several decades, there's been an understanding that the goal of export controls around this dual-use technology is really appropriate in the context of non-proliferation for military end use or military end users. And what we see with the October 7th export controls is a shift in what the US is willing to use export controls for. This is certainly not the first time that the US has been willing to be more assertive in export control policy, particularly with list-based issues like the listing of Huawei. But this is really a shift towards export controls for regional stability purposes, really for the purpose of preventing the development of an advanced computing ecosystem and related technologies in China. And so when we speak with our allies and partners, the first issue is around getting on the same page in terms of what is an appropriate goal for the imposition of export controls. And this has already been made very clear by other panelists today. Craig was talking about how the dangers of unilateral imposition of export controls for US companies, Jimmy in talking about how important the affirmative steps are rather than just focusing on the defensive steps, as well as our reliance on allies and partners for rebalancing our supply chain, not just indigenizing everything to ourselves. And Martin also bringing up really excellent points about the limits of this. And so the kind of first part is determining how are we going, what are the shared goals that we have that have to form the basis of what we're willing to do multilaterally. And Martin is 100% right that part of this is going to require tough conversations about what we might be willing to give up in order to retain a multilateral coalition. And this is made even harder by the fact that whenever we are engaging multilaterally, our allies and partners have different legal constraints that they have to contend with. And so when you think about what's happening right now with discussions with the Dutch and the Japanese around around multilateralizing the October 7th controls, one of the concerns is that that what the US can do, particularly with respect to controls to restrict US person support for semiconductor ecosystems in China, is not necessarily what our allies and partners can do. And so there are kind of legal constraints on how much our allies and partners can follow us, even if they wanted to. But there are also differences around whether there are legitimate differences among partners negotiating in good faith about whether export controls are really effective policy solutions to concerns over the PRC's ambitions. Right? And the report that we're discussing today does an excellent job of laying out some of the negative consequences of such controls. And the other panelists have also done a really excellent job. I don't need to kind of rehash all of the concerns that they've laid on the table. But another thing to consider is that if we think in terms of interdependent networks and how they operate, we also need to think really carefully about how keeping China in a global semiconductor technology network, rather than pushing them out of it, can be very helpful to managing the relationship safely. And so we should be mindful as well of the challenges and potential security concerns that develop from decoupling, and how decoupling can generate new incentives for aggressive behavior that are actually harder to manage because of decoupling. And so we need to create more space for allies and partners, as well as civil society within our own polity, to be able to discuss and debate what are the right policy choices here, because it's very easy today in DC, in Washington, to label anyone who has some qualms with some of what we're trying to do as being apologists for China or not tough enough on China. And we need to create more space so that we can have reasoned discussions about the fact that this is new territory, right? That we don't have good data. We don't know what will happen as we put more and more of these controls in place, and that we need to proceed cautiously, and we need to hear all sides in terms of all of the stakeholders that come into play to maintain our ability to stay on the forefront of advanced technology and semiconductors. I think Martin made some really excellent points about the limits of Wassenaar, as well as the need to move the Chip 4 Alliance into Europe and not just be around East Asia, and also the kind of challenges associated with that because of concerns over bringing Taiwan into that alliance structure in a kind of clear way. But I will say that when it comes to how we bring our partners and allies into these discussions, the foreign direct product rule is a kind of a quick and easy way to try to muscle others in to an alliance, but it is not a good long-term policy because the more that we use those kinds of tools, the more that we are giving not just China the incentive to design out US technology, but we're also communicating to our partners and allies and major semiconductor firms in those countries that we are maybe not the most reliable partner. And we've been spending the last several years trying to rebuild a reputation of being a reliable partner. And the more that we kind of rely on that heavy-handedness, the more that we're really just communicating that global firms can't build their global strategies on the back of US technology. And so they need to find a way to move around US tech. And that puts the US into a much weaker position than we are now, and we should avoid it. So with that, I will turn the mic back over.
Super. Thank you, Sarah. Really, the point you made about the need for creating space for policy discussions, just a really very important one. I have a couple questions, and then I'll throw some questions from the audience to our very knowledgeable panelists. The first question maybe to both Craig and Jimmy. Craig, and you pointed out that China definitely, I mean, there's a very big potential for China to retaliate, right? And how do you think China will retaliate given the actions coming out of the US? And we all know for a fact that when the sweeping chip ban was announced last October, the Chinese was in such a sense of shock. They kind of didn't know what to do at the beginning. And then as time goes on, we sort of have seen some actions coming out of Beijing bits and pieces. And just this morning, I got alert, MOFA alert. A senior official in Beijing and MOFA just invited the China rep for Boeing for a coffee chat. So I don't know what kind of message that is sending here, but from what your conversations with your members on the ground in China, how do you think China will retaliate? And any actions have you already seen?
Great, thank you, Ling Ling. So China has a good number of tools, legal tools, by which they could retaliate. But thus far, they have chosen not to use them. I suspect that their calculus is that if they do retaliate, for example, against a chip company or a manufacturing equipment company, a tool company, or another type of company, then that will lead to further restrictions on the inflow of technology and of product into China. And so they have not found a way to retaliate that suits their interests, and I hope it stays that way. But over the longer term, China has remarkable scale and speed. And that scale, access to their market, as well as their ability to really ramp up manufacturing on a global basis, as well as the speed that we see within Chinese manufacturing is quite formidable. And and their dominance in the processing of rare earths, for example, is something that we should be concerned about. It's not going to go away quickly. You're not going to change global supply chains quickly. Let's hope that we could stay away from a cycle of provocation, retaliation, that could have extremely deleterious consequences over time. So far, so good. We have not seen that. Let's hope that we don't see it. Thank you.
Great. Fingers crossed. And so, Jimmy, from your members, many of your members have, have had massive investments in China over the years, and China still is an important market. What do they think after all those measures that are coming out of Washington? Have their operations in China being threatened in any way? And what is your assessment of Xi Jinping's this self-reliance effort? How successful do you think they will be in terms of this, using the whole force of the nation to try to catch up with the US and other developed countries in terms of chip design, manufacturing? Can they be successful at some point down the road?
Well, Ling Ling, two really good, difficult but important questions. So on the first one, I think for US semiconductor companies, certainly China is a big market. Many of their top customers have their supply chains there. However, in terms of actual manufacturing supply chains, US companies actually do a lot less than you think. Only about 1% of US front-end semiconductor manufacturing is in mainland China. Now, that's not to say the global chip industry itself, many multinational companies have investments there. Taiwanese, Korean, other firms have anywhere between 15 to 25% of their production. But relatively speaking, US companies have a smaller production footprint in mainland China. It's important to point out that all the policies that we've seen come to fruition here are being driven by the US government. And, the industry has kind of been standing on the sidelines watching a lot of these. We have not had the kind of input into the process that we would have liked. Many of the rules, for example, last summer came out by surprise to the industry through these is-informed letters that went out to several chip makers telling them they had to stop the sale of chips flowing to China that had been already on the market for 2 or 3 years. So a lot of this was a bit jarring and came as a surprise to the industry. We hope, like Craig has pointed out, that the Chinese government understands that these are government actions, and we hope that the industry isn't kind of drawn into this broader sort of challenge right now that's very complicated between both of the governments. In terms of China's long-term prospects, so far the majority of the export controls have been limited to the most cutting-edge technology, particularly the October 7 rules, the most advanced AI chips going to supercomputing, and equipment for the production of semiconductors below certain or above certain thresholds. The vast majority of chips don't depend on, and applications don't depend on, those advanced technologies. So, and many of those are still unrestricted because they're ubiquitous. China has a lot more stronger domestic capability to produce them. So it's not like all of a sudden China's future has been completely eliminated in the semiconductor space. There still is a lot of room for Chinese companies, for multinational companies in China to conduct normal trade and investment within the confines of these different rules and regulations. Whether or not anyone could be independent, putting aside China's policies, our policies, I think the answer is no. It's too complex, too global, too interdependent for one country to be able to produce all of these technologies on their own. I think China knows that, because around their hesitancy for taking stronger retaliatory steps, they still need access to technology from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the United States, Germany, Netherlands, and sort of wolf warrior diplomacy around semiconductors will just put that in further jeopardy. So, I think so far they've taken a fairly balanced approach, cautious that this could escalate further, and so far have, kept many of the tools they could use in the toolbox, and not really deployed them. And we hope from an industry perspective that stays the case, and that the governments can engage in some sort of dialogue and discussion to, I wouldn't say find a happy medium, but at least start to understand each other's positions, bottom lines, and potentially draw up some new rules of the road.
Really, really appreciate your commentary, Jimmy. I always learn so much from listening to Jimmy talk. Yet again, a good lesson here. This whole conversation also reminds me of, when we were covering the trade war, a very senior official working for Liu He talked about, how the trade war, that the intention was really to, keeping China down for, their economic and technology, advances. And at one point, this advisor, this senior official talked about, well, you can't let China only make T-shirts while the U.S. does high tech. That's unreasonable. So back then, there were suspicion in Beijing about the U.S. motives, and believed that Washington wanted to keep China from advancing. But now it seems that that's already quite clear for an objective for a lot of policy making in Washington. And Martin, we've got a lot of great questions from our audience, and I'll just to try to squeeze as many of those questions in as possible. The first question, maybe this one's for you, Martin. The industry is extremely dependent on supplier capability. What are the challenges in controlling both domestic suppliers, such as the LAM, and international ones like ASML, in terms of their ability in assisting China?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the U.S., the way you have to think is actually philosophically about export controls, which is that, if you want any export control to be useful, export means it leaves your jurisdiction. It leaves your borders. But if that good can leave your border and then get diverted to the place you don't want it to go, then that export control is pretty useless. And if you try to put a control on something and someone else makes it, it's pretty useless. So there are kind of multiple ways that U.S. can go about it, but there are limited points of leverage. So generally, in export controls, if a good has a certain amount of even if it's made abroad, has a certain amount of U.S. content, depending on what it is, it could be zero, like nearly zero. It could be 10%, could be 25% of the content is American, then it still falls under U.S. export controls. But the way what's been used more recently is to say, well, these chips produced in Taiwan, for example, are made with American design tools and American manufacturing equipment. Can we claim jurisdiction on those? And they've now done so, but in limited, generally in limited senses. So I think the U.S., I would give the U.S. some credit for being very judicious about the use of FDPR. In the October 7th rules, for example, it's only applied to the kind of supercomputer kinds of chips. They don't apply it to, the chips that, for example, go into your iPhone, which are still probably going to go into your iPhone in Zhengzhou, even though these chips are far below the thresholds, even far more advanced than the thresholds that are set in the requirements. So when it comes to, the U.S. has a lot of leverage over, essentially unlimited over the U.S. Suppliers because it's American content, and of course a little bit less over those Americans manufacturing abroad, unless they use this FDPR, for example. And then over firms like ASML, it's very interesting because it depends. If ASML needs a laser for its EUV machines, it needs to get them from the San Diego company that they bought, called Simon. But in the less advanced ones, they don't, there might be other suppliers of those. So if the US has a choke point where we are the only supplier, we have some leverage. If there are other places and if they can switch out the US laser for a laser made in Germany or somewhere else, then we don't really have any sort of leverage. And actually pulling that leverage point might benefit you for a very short period of time, but then immediately the next time the next machine is designed, you design out the US. I'd just like to say one thing, Ling Ling, on what you said earlier before the question, is I think the US has really tried to keep this very narrow. And they've tried to say we are not, and I think it's credible to say they're not totally trying to hold back all of China's technological development. And the challenge is where you draw the line. They say they're using the small yard high fence that has been talked about over and over again. But in chips, it's something they consider to be foundational. They say these chips are used in all sorts of military equipment, but also the most advanced industry. And the problem is, most of this impact is going to be on completely non-military. But then there is a piece that's military. And it's really, really hard to where you draw the line here. And I think that there's a lot of good debate about this, and there could be more.
Can I just add in on that point? Because I just want to echo what Martin said. I think that it's really, I understand why people would make a connection to the trade war, but I don't think that it's necessarily the right connection to make because, first of all, it's a different administration, it's a different tool. The trade war had a lot more to do with the Trump administration's kind of focus on the trade balance, and those were things that he was willing to negotiate away in terms of negotiations with the PRC. What's happening right now with export controls is different, and as Martin said, the administration really was trying to thread a needle there. And that's why the controls were so complicated. So I think that one of the things that I want to do here is to say, we don't need to have this conversation stay at the level of is the PRC a threat to the US or not? Because even if we all agree that there are real concerns, particularly with issues like Made in China 2025, with military civil fusion and so forth, there are still, even if we agree that there's a concern, there can be varying opinions on what we actually should do about that concern. And so I think that where the kind of best conversation from a policy perspective can focus on is, well, if we go down this route, kind of what are the potential negative consequences that are also going to affect national security that we're not thinking about because we're focused on the problem and we're not kind of fully able to figure out what the second order effects of a policy response might be.
A great follow-up point. Thank you, Sarah. I guess, one major actor here in this equation, because the policy is not being made in a vacuum, is China itself, right? Martin talked about the civil military fusion program, because the lack of distinction in China these days between the state and private sector has made it very hard to have a targeted approach, because Xi Jinping has severely, broadly expanded definition of national security. Anything, any information, any tool, any company can be used or manipulated for the name in the name of national security. So it is extremely hard to get that balance right. I'm not a policymaker. I can't imagine how hard it is to try to balance all the demands and the concerns. I do have a question for Craig and also Jimmy. I mean, Jimmy talked about the need to resume dialogue between the US and China side in terms of, maybe just explaining to them what the rules are, right? I think not too many Chinese officials really get it. They go extremes. Sometimes you talk to them, oh, they're like, we're destroyed. Our whole industry is being destroyed. And other times you talk to them and they would say, oh, we're so smart. We can figure this out. So for you, Craig, what's your assessment about the chances of a resumption of dialogue between US and China, especially given what's going on right now after the Bloomgate? Tensions are running so high. The Russia question, again, is back on the agenda. What are you hearing from both sides in terms of the potential for resumption of dialogue?
So I think that in the trip that Secretary Blinken was planning to make to Beijing, this was going to be a major subject of discussion, and that both sides could have put together a number of meaningful dialogues that could have included technology. Certainly agriculture, climate change, public health, avoiding military conflict, crisis avoidance would be probably at the top of the list. But in addition to that, I think a dialogue on the rules of the road for technology, and particularly semiconductors, would be excellent, so that both sides could explain their policies to each other, so that the other side doesn't overreact to them. And that would be an excellent start. So my understanding of the current situation is that it is hoped that the two leaders will meet over a video conference, and that might lead to the scheduling of Secretary Blinken's visit to China to establish some much needed dialogues. But this has all been put off now, and due to the fact that the Chinese are going into their own political season from about March 3 to about March 12 or something like that, I can't imagine it happening before then. And so I suspect that there will be a delay. And of course, unpleasant things might happen during the delay, which could cause further delay. So there's a kind of an unfortunate series of unanticipated events that have put this off and could put it off again. Let's hope that we begin the dialogue as soon as possible. It is desperately needed, particularly at the mill-to-mill level on crisis avoidance, but in these other subjects as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jimmy, I'm just wondering if you have anything to add.
No, I think Craig covered it well on that one.
Okay, great. So I will turn this conversation back to Tiff and Jeremy to let them comment on the feedback you both have received from the four panelists here.
Well, I could go ahead and start. I wanted just to highlight comments by each of the speakers that were, all their comments were absolutely fascinating, but one for each that really stuck out to me, and then pose a question maybe we won't answer today, but something I think worth considering. I found it, I had thought about what Craig talked about, the challenge of with the US persons restrictions of actually forcing top engineers to basically choose sides between the US and China, and obviously something that we would like to avoid. I also found it very interesting, Craig's comment that we might actually run the risk, and maybe we already are, of losing access to Chinese talent, which obviously we all know, the world knows about the tremendous talent of Chinese engineers. So I guess my question would be, and again, not necessarily to answer today, but is there a way to ensure, even as we do have restrictions on access or relations in certain advanced semiconductors, on China, is there a way to also ensure that we do not lose access to Chinese talent and Chinese engineers? Moving through the comments here, I found it also very illuminating, Jimmy's comment that 50% of value add, of course, is in design. I'm wondering whether, is it appropriate? And if so, what steps might the US want to take to try to ensure that the US keeps again, you said 50% of value add is in design. The US is very much a leader, but China is coming up quickly. So what steps, if appropriate, might the US take to try to ensure that the US continues to keep that lead in design over China? Martin, I found fascinating both your the point very well taken that in order to bring more allies, more countries on board with US sanctions, we might have to water them down or decide what we're willing to give up, because obviously not all of our interests will perfectly align with those of our allies. I also found it fascinating, and I think this is obviously a very real point, the challenge we face in bringing in allies, including European allies, if Taiwan is going to have a central point have a central role in whatever organization we have to bring us together. I guess my question would be, is it worth somehow limiting Taiwan's role, which seems very difficult given Taiwan's absolutely critical role in manufacturing with TSMC and advanced semiconductors. But are we going to be in a situation where we have to limit Taiwan's role in order to ensure participation by, for example, European allies? And then just quickly running through these, I read with great interest Sarah's work on the potential for, as I mentioned earlier, restrictions on outbound investment, including in advanced semiconductors. And I guess we didn't really have a chance to discuss that, but one question in my mind certainly is what would be the role of restrictions on outbound investment, the sort of the reverse CFIUS when it comes to managing our relationship with China in advanced semiconductors. Just want to throw those 4 ideas out, and that's all from me.
All right, why don't I jump in here, do this quickly because everybody's been listening to a lot of different perspectives. I'd like to thank everybody for all of your insights. It's humbling after spending several months working on a topic like this to listen to the kind of expertise that is out there. Martin, in particular, I'm convinced that you were looking over my shoulder at my outline, because virtually everything that I threw out because I didn't have space, you then picked up immediately in your 4 points, and I was impressed with that. Sarah, your perspective on interdependence was really reassuring to me because Tiff and I kind of went back and forth in our discussions about how much emphasis we wanted to give to interdependence. I mean, essentially, has that ship already sailed from the point of view of the Washington debate? And I find it reassuring to hear sort of that the perspective that you bring to this from Bloomington, shall we say. It's a very solid analysis. Nonetheless, in talking about those fine lines that the administration has drawn, I think that the point that we were making in the paper, particularly in the first portion on U.S. policy, is that there is a tremendous amount of momentum to drive these restrictions against China further. And the debate in Washington is remarkably one-sided and has been for quite a while. And the voices suggesting that there's a more nuanced approach are fairly muted, frankly, and the bureaucracies themselves have a fairly strong weight in this at the moment. So as does Congress. The restrictions in the Defense Authorization Act on the use of Chinese-made chips, for example, from YMTC, I know you cause many companies a great deal of worry about, do we have to start sifting through the chips that are in our, our construction equipment as we build a chip factory, for example. There's a lot of issues that still have to be addressed, but I think that this group has really done a very nice job of laying out a lot of the responses. On the point of retaliation, Jimmy and Craig both kind of came at this, and I think you make an important point that China remains highly dependent on imported technology, imported chips, and I think that in a sense that's a sign of hope, at least for the medium term. If you look at the Taiwan issue at the moment and China's fulminations about Pelosi's visit or any other number of steps, the actual sanctions that have been imposed against Taiwan have been largely focused on agricultural products. And the flow of semiconductors, the flow of electronics, the flow of related technology across the Taiwan Straits continues unimpeded. And I think, I talked about guardrails in my opening remarks. I think that this is an example of guardrails. And so it's important that these things be kept in mind. And in closing, I would just say that I came to the Atlantic Council from the International Monetary Fund, where I spent 2+ decades working on financial crises with colleagues. And the one thing that you come to learn about the globalized economy from that perspective is that the law of unintended consequences is always in play. And I think we've seen that with semiconductors, the dangers of actions that can have seismic implications. Just look at what happened to the semiconductor industry during the first 2 years of the pandemic with the shortages because of unexpected demand. Any number of shocks can change calculations about how an industry operates. And I think it has to be a cautionary tale for all of us as we examine these issues. So, and again, thank you all for the time you gave us today. We're really appreciative.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Awesome. I'll just add one quick point, and before I close our session today, it's such an honor to listen to each and every one of you, just offering your very thoughtful remarks on this very important report. Congratulations again to you, Tim, and to you, Jeremy. This is really exactly the kind of conversation that I only hope could be also taking place within the walls of Zhongnanhai. One thing we're sure about is that whatever the US is doing is having a big impact on China. They are very much worried about losing foreign investors, foreign investments. Well, whether or not the worry will translate into some positive actions on China's part to try to re-embrace market forces, re-embrace the Western world. That's a big question mark. And I hope all of you can dig deeper into if there's any chance for Washington to move China into the right direction. So anyway, thank you all so much, and thank you to our audience as well. Please let's all give our panelists a round of virtual applause. Thank you.